Today at Speedy's Garage we're going to perform the Tundra brake upgrade on the 02 4Runner, and these are the junkyard Tundra calipers that I showed you how to rebuild and paint a couple of weeks ago. I also picked up some new stainless steel braided lines to replace the factory rubber lines on the vehicle. The car has about 100,000 miles on it, so they're probably due, and I figure if I'm replacing them I might as well upgrade them at the same time. For brake pads, I'm going to use the Wagner Thermal Quiet pad. It does have the chamfered edge on it that a lot of people don't like. They argue that that reduces your brake pad surface area. I'm really not all that worried about it. I really like these pads. I've used them before. They're low dust, they're quiet. They have a built-in anti-squeal shim, so you don't have to have separate shims, and they say do not use any grease or anything for the install. So I like that. I did pick up some new caliper pins. The ones that were in the junkyard calipers were a little beat up. I wanted everything to be new and nice and shiny. These were cheap. They're like $5 a set at the parts store, and I went with some Wherever part number 14023, and the Wagner pads did come with some new springs to go along with the brake pads themselves. Okay, so we're going to use some .4 synthetic brake fluid. We're going to need some of that. I got a quart because I plan to flush the brake fluid at the same time. Again, I've never done anything to this car's brake system. It's 11 years old and has 100,000 miles on it, so it's due. Some brake parts cleaner, Wherever, picked that up at the parts store. And these are little clips that snap in and hold the caliper retaining pins into the caliper. These are like 3 cents a piece at the dealer. And the part number, so I can get the focus on this, is 47749-35040. For rotors, I went with some Stop Tech slotted rotors, and there are the part numbers. They are side specific, driver and passenger, because the direction of the slots has to go with the direction of rotation. I went with these because they're a high quality rotor. They have a very nice finish on them, so they won't get rusty and gross looking, and they're very clean on the machined area. They were only about $30 more than the Brembo blanks that a lot of people use, so to me it was worth the upgrade to have the slotted rotors. So now all we got to do is get ready for the install. To assist in bleeding the brakes, I'm going to build a brake bleeder that'll connect to my shop air to make it a little bit easier. It consists of a 2-inch to 3/4 rubber reducer, a 3/4 to 1/2 inch 90-degree elbow, 1/2 inch nipple, a 1/2 inch to 3/8 metal reducer, a 3/8 to 1/4 bushing, and then a 1/4 inch quick connect for my air. To make sure the parts seal together, I'm going to use some Teflon tape. I got all this at the hardware store for about 14 bucks. This is optional, but I recommend it. This is a regulator that I'm going to connect to my brake bleeder once I have it built. It's got a 1/4 inch female quick connect on one side and a 1/4 inch male quick connect on the other. The regulator comes just by itself, so I had to get these two parts separate. The way this will work, this side will connect to the brake bleeder, this side will connect to shop air. I'll set this to 15 psi, and it will ensure that that psi is maintained regardless of what the shop air pressure is. The brake system is sensitive. You don't want to over pressurize it, and 15 pounds is about the max you want to put through it. Now you can just put the regulator directly to the brake bleeder, but I find these to be pretty handy when I'm painting or doing other projects, so I built mine that I can use it on a variety of tools. So these are the tools you're going to need: a jack, a couple of jack stands, the brake bleeder tool, or a partner to help you bleed the brakes, some 3/16 ID clear line, a wooden handled hammer or rubber handled hammer. You're going to use this to help make the brake pads spread apart. You might also need a C-clamp for that. This is to get the factory caliper off. You know, the pads are going to be pressed against the rotor, so you have to have something to back that off a little bit. A 10mm wrench for your bleeder screw and your hard line to the caliper. You can also use a flare wrench if you've got one. A couple of torque wrenches. You'll need one that goes up to 90 foot-pounds and one that goes all the way down to 8. You might need a crowfoot extension for the hard line connection as well. You're going to need some sockets, specifically a 17mm to get to the 2 caliper mounting bolts. I like these for my impact. They're swivel, makes things work nice. A 19mm for the lug nuts. I'm going to be using an impact gun for this. And a turkey baster. I'm going to use this to get all the old fluid out of the master cylinder before I fill it with fresh fluid for the flush. Okay, to start the brake install, first thing I'm going to do is clean up around the reservoir, the brake fluid reservoir, really well on the master cylinder. You don't want any dirt or debris to get in there. And then I'm actually going to use the turkey baster to take some fluid out of the reservoir till it's almost empty and fill it with fresh fluid. And this is so I don't forget later when we get to the point of bleeding the brakes. You always want to be careful with brake fluid. It will remove paint if left on the surface. So if you spill any, wipe it off right away. Now don't use your wife's turkey baster for this, obviously. The brake fluid will actually melt the plastic and the bulb. So it's pretty much a one-use deal. You can try to clean it up with some brake cleaner, but it's probably going to melt it too. They're $2 at Walmart, so I just got one to throw away. Now we're going to fill the reservoir back up with fresh fluid, so that when we flush the system, we've got good fluid going through it. Make sure you recap the reservoir when you're through filling it. If you start messing with the brake calipers with the cap off, brake fluid will spray out of there. Next, get the truck securely supported on jack stands and remove your wheels. Okay, to start the process, we're going to remove the stock retaining spring on the factory caliper. Then we're going to hook up a clear vinyl tube to the bleed nipple, along with a 10mm flare wrench. We're going to crack the bleed screw open, and we're going to use a wooden handled hammer to spread the brake pads apart. The reason you crack the bleed screws, it makes this process easier, and you don't push dirty fluid back up through the master cylinder. And obviously I got the tube burned into an old oil container, so it catches the old fluid. And what you're looking for is for the pads to be loose against the rotor. That'll make it easier to pull the caliper off. That'll be good enough. And if your caliper happens to be especially stubborn, you can go at it with a C-clamp. Just clamp it on and force the pad apart. Mine worked just fine with the wooden handle though. Now I'm replacing this old factory rubber brake line with a nice braided stainless steel one. So now I'm going to have to come in and loosen these hardline connections. There's one there, it's a 10mm, and there's one back here that's also a 10mm. Now you can try to use a 10mm box end wrench or something on them. This truck's about 12 years old, so they're frozen. So I went and picked up some flare nut wrenches, which are designed specifically for these type of connections. It makes a more firm connection, and it has a slot in it to slide over the brake line. So I'm going to be using one of those. I tried a 10mm and it just wouldn't do it. And I started by soaking all this in WD-40. Let it soak a couple of hours to make these spring clips easier to remove and these bolts easier to loosen. So I'm going to start by loosening the hard line and get it started. When you loosen these, a little bit of brake fluid will come out, so make sure you've got a pan or something underneath. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this clip. To make it easier to work with it. I'm going to do the same thing on the upper one. Okay, so I found it easiest, and once I disconnected the two banjo fittings, I just took the stock brake line out and I put the stainless steel braided one in, and I loosely attached it with the little spring clips so it would hold it in place. It's keyed so that it won't turn while you're tightening these banjo bolts. And you only torque these down to like 8 or 11 foot-pounds. I didn't have a torque wrench that went that low, so I just tightened them snug, and I'll check them to make sure they're not seeping any fluid over a couple of hours while I'm finishing up the rest of the project to make sure that they're tight enough. When I got to the top and took it off the top connection, obviously brake fluid is dripping out of that at a constant rate. A 3/16 vacuum plug will snap right on the bottom of that hard brake line and stop the leak. And that gives you time to work without having to rush and be all jittery about it with brake fluid going everywhere. Make sure you got plenty of rags on everything to catch any drips. Obviously, brake fluid does eat paint. This is all suspension parts, and they get a lot of abuse anyway, but you want to try to keep it off as much as possible. And once you get everything lined up, the hard lines, you may have to massage them a little bit to get them to connect. Just tighten them down. Like I said, I think it's 8 or 11 foot-pounds is the torque spec on those. I just did them snug until they stop dripping. And then just put your spring clip back in. There's a groove on the top of the brake line to hold it against that bracket. Once you get it started, just give it a couple of light taps with a hammer till it seats. Next, you just want to remove the two 17mm caliper mounting bolts. When you take the second one out, be ready to catch the caliper because it is a little bit heavy. And you want to watch the metal line. Try not to bend it too much. It'll make it hard to line it back up. And then the caliper just comes right off. And the rotor is actually held on by the caliper, so it will come off as well. Now obviously you have to remove the hard line connected to the caliper before you can actually remove the caliper itself. When it comes off, like I said before, there's fluid in here. Stuck a 3/16 vacuum plug on the end of it, and now I can take my time mounting up the new caliper. So here's the upgraded Tundra caliper on the left versus the factory 2002 4Runner caliper on the right. You can see the Tundra caliper is much larger. It'll hold a larger brake pad, and the rotor is actually thicker. So you get 3 areas of performance increase. I'm not going to pull one of the factory 4Runner pads out because they're kind of nasty. I'm going to pack this caliper away in the attic in case I ever need it. But here is one of the new Tundra pads. And if you compare it to that factory 4Runner pad in the caliper there, you can see the Tundra one is much larger. And what really surprised me is these are the factory brake pads that are still in this caliper. The truck has almost 100,000 miles on it. I've had it 11 or 12 years. I was shocked that the pads still look that good. So here's the factory 2002 4Runner rotor on the right versus the new Tundra power slot rotor on the left. They're the same diameter, but you can see how much thicker the Tundra rotor is versus the 2002 4Runner rotor. and that'll help with cooling and heat dissipation as well as warping. To get the larger caliper to fit, we have to trim some of the dust shield on our 2002 4Runner. And the way I figured out where is I just roughly held this up, got an idea, used a silver Sharpie to mark. And I'll use an air saw to cut it. And then I test fit the rotor, and it's very close to this rounded off edge here of the dust shield. It doesn't touch now, but I'm afraid with heat, and heat makes metal expand, I'm afraid it might start to rub. So I'm going to come in with a die grinder and a sanding wheel and just shave that back maybe 1/8 of an inch or so to give room for that expansion should it happen. When you start trimming this dust shield, make sure you're wearing safety goggles. You don't want to get any of this metal in your eye. And I'm going to hold it, the other side of it, with a pair of pliers. It'll hold it still while I cut. So there's the trim dust shield, top and bottom. Now I'm going to come in, like I said, with the die grinder and hit this edge here. And I'm also going to clean these up so they're not sharp. So there's the rotor test fit, and you can see we got quite a bit of clearance there now. And you don't have to have a angle grinder or a body saw to trim this dust shield. You can actually use a Dremel with a cutoff wheel. I know most people have those. So that's all trimmed up, everything fits. I'm going to come in and hit it with some paint just so it doesn't rust. I'm just using some leftover high temp grill paint that I had. Now we can mount up the new rotor, and make sure you clean it well with some brake parts cleaner. I already did the back side before I put it on. Now I'm just going to do the front. You can use a couple of lug nuts to hold it in place. And if you do the power slot rotors like I did, make sure you pay attention to driver's side and passenger side. They are side specific. And now we can install the caliper without the brake pads in it. Make sure it's empty, and make sure you've pushed the cylinders all the way back as far as they'll go. That'll give room to put the pads in. And once you've snugged the caliper mounting bolts, go ahead and reconnect the hard line. Now you want to tighten the caliper mounting bolt to 90 foot-pounds. Now those caliper mounting bolts are critical, so make sure you do torque them 90 foot-pounds as specified. Don't wing it on that one. And as you're doing this process, make sure you're keeping an eye on the reservoir. You never want to let it drop below the min mark, because you can start having problems with the master cylinder. If you let this thing go dry or get air in it, you actually have to go to Toyota to get it bled. It requires one of their scan tools. Now we can load the caliper with our new pads. It's real simple. The round side goes in with the back plate against the piston. If yours happen to have shims, you'll put a little bit of grease and attach the shim to the back, and then just slide the pad in until the caliper retaining pin holes line up. And you want to come in with your retaining spring. And it will go like that. And finally, caliper retaining pins, or pad retaining pins, I guess we should call them. There it goes. And finally, install your caliper, I should call it the pad retaining pin. And like I said before, I like the factory Toyota ones a lot better than the ones that came with the brake pads. So I got some of those from the dealer, and they're only like a nickel. That's all there is to it. So now it's time to bleed the brakes. And I've hooked up the adapter I showed you I built earlier. I've got the regulator set at just a tick under 20 psi. This isn't the most accurate gauge, so I've tested it and I put enough pressure on it so that fluid comes out nice and smooth. And now just hook up a clear tube to your bleeder screw and crack it open, and the pressure from our tool up there on the master cylinder will force the air out. And you'll let this drain until you don't see any air bubbles at all. And keep an eye on the reservoir. Don't let it go dry during this process. Okay, so I went ahead and bled the passenger side first, and then I came back and bled the driver's side. You want to do the one that's the furthest from the master cylinder. That's to get the front brakes set up since they're the ones we changed. Now I'm going to move to the back and go ahead and bleed the passenger side rear because it's actually the farthest from the master cylinder. And like I said, I was going to flush the fluid on this vehicle anyway, so this is part of that process, but you do need to make sure you bleed all the brakes if you crack the system open at all like we did just to replace the front ones. You need to go ahead and do front and back. So I'll do back passenger, then back driver, then I will come back and recheck front passenger, and finally front driver to make sure we don't have any air. So now I've got the complete brake system bled. I'm going to take the pressure off the regulator just to be safe. Even though it's got a quick connect on it, I want to take a chance of that popping off and brake fluid going everywhere. And finally come in and top off the brake fluid reservoir until it's at the max mark. And now key the ignition on and listen for the ABS pump to prime. If it stops in about 20 seconds, you know you're good to go. With the ignition off, pump the brakes until the brake pedal gives you a real firm feel, and come back and check all your connections for any seepage. Make sure they're not leaking. Reinstall your wheels and just put the lug nuts on snug. Take the vehicle off the jack stands and torque the lug nuts to 83 foot-pounds in a star pattern. Here, 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 etc. And then do one time around to make sure they're all at 83. Drive the vehicle about 500 miles and then double check your torque. And once you've triple checked everything, it's time to take the vehicle for a test drive. And make sure you do it in a controlled area. You know, just a slow drive around the block first to make sure the brakes are working properly before you take it out on the highway. So after you've gone for a test drive, you can take it out and bed in the brakes. This isn't required, but it's something I typically do just to get everything set and ensure long pad life and rotor life. And basically how you do it is you drive up to 60 miles an hour and you gently apply the brakes and bring the vehicle down to 45 or 50 miles an hour, and you do that 5 or 6 times in a row to heat the rotor up to get it up to operating temperature. And then you want to go up to 60 and then really apply the brakes hard, almost engaging ABS, and bring it down to 10 miles an hour and do that 5 or 6 times. And what that's going to do is it's going to get the rotor really hot, and it's going to transfer just a little bit of brake material, brake pad material over to the rotor and give it a nice coating. And that helps the two pieces marry together a little bit better and gives you better braking performance in the long run. You don't want to come to a complete stop when you're performing this process, otherwise too much pad material can transfer while you're stopped and the brake pads are clamped on the rotor because it's going to be so hot. You might smell a little bit of brake smell and might even see a little bit of smoke, and that's normal. I don't know if you can tell, but when you've done it properly, the rotor will have kind of a blue haze to it, letting you know it got up to a good hot temperature and make that happen. After you've done the final panic stop, take it up on the highway and drive it for 10 or 15 minutes without touching the brakes, or at least not touching them as much as possible. Obviously you want to be safe and not run in the back of somebody or run over something, but touch them as little as possible to give the rotor a chance to cool down. One thing you do need to be aware of when performing this Tundra brake upgrade is that not all wheels will fit over the calipers. Some of the factory 4Runner wheels will, and some will not. I do know the Ivan Stewart TRD wheels will fit, and these are level 8 MK6 wheels. They will fit, and I knew they would when I ordered them. I had intended to making this upgrade when I ordered the wheels and tires. And this particular wheel will fit the 4Runner, but it was also listed for a 2000 to 2006 Tundra. So I knew that, that this wheel would fit with no problems. You'll definitely want to check that out before you make the upgrade. This is another upgrade that really has no downside. The brakes work much better. They have a better feel to them. I didn't notice any difference in pedal travel. Some people have talked about that the pedal seems to travel a little bit further. If it does, it must not be by very much because I couldn't tell the difference. The thicker rotor will certainly help prevent the rotor warping that the stock brake system has an issue with. and the install really isn't that bad, and the parts are relatively inexpensive. I think the red paint turned out great and goes nice with the gray wheels and the TRD center caps. And the decals I had made up are just the icing on the cake. I think they really fit with this upgrade. If you need some of those, shoot me an email, speedysgarage@comcast.net, and I'll get you a set sent out. They're relatively inexpensive. If you'd like more information on some of the projects I've completed, visit my website, www.speedysgarage.net.